Hey guys, in this podcast we talk about third-party opinions. Please know that we have no intention of misrepresenting them, and we apologize if we do so in advance. Thanks. Hey guys, welcome back to another Contemplation Hypothezation. I'm Nick.
I'm Paul.
And today we're going to be talking about...
Is it reasonable to believe in God?
Yeah, and we just want to clarify that we're not debating religion here.
Yeah.
We're just trying to see, in our world, given everything, would it be reasonable to believe in God? And we should also add that Paul will be taking the side for God, I'll be taking the side against God, and then we want to say that, though, we're not affiliated with that side. We're just arguing those sides.
Right. We just want to examine the arguments and stuff and see where it leads us and stuff.
Right.
So let me just jump in real quick. Just a little brief personal history. I grew up in a Christian family, and I attended a church that was relatively dogmatic about not questioning your faith in God. You know, not having doubts. When I had a doubt, they'd tell me it's because I lacked faith. I didn't have enough faith to get over that doubt. And so what happened during adolescence when I was confronted with different worldviews, different opinions, different scientific data, is that all of this doubt built up to the point where I couldn't really believe in God anymore. So another thing that contributed to me sort of becoming an atheist at one point was this notion that most scientists are atheists. Now the thing that's really interesting about this is actually the American Science Foundation just published a study that showed that I think it was either 80 or 90% of scientists were atheists a priori becoming a scientist. And when I say a priori, I just mean before. And so most scientists were atheists before becoming a scientist, and most scientists' work does not deal with these matters of whether or not God exists. So this idea that because most people in the scientific community believe in atheism is somehow an argument for atheism is just not the case. And so that's something that, although I think it encourages a lot of people to become atheists, it's something that needs to be examined more for a reason to be an atheist. I mean, I'm sure that most scientists are not familiar with the arguments for the existence of God. They're mainly focused on a specialized field.
Right. Gotcha.
Then, take a year or two later, I started really thinking about these questions and examining them. One of the first things I recognized was that there's a discourse between science and religion that's unnecessary. This idea that science and religion are two separate entities is not the case. What most philosophers who are religious believe is that science is just our way of understanding God's creation, the way that God created the world. Obviously, most of the discourse comes between creationism versus evolution. Now, a lot of current scientists who are theists believe that God guided evolution. And there's actually a lot of really strong arguments to how God guided evolution. But what most people in the scientific community sort of have this discourse from is this idea that God created this earth just 6,000 years ago, because most of the scientific data doesn't suggest that. But I think as someone who's looking at this, you need to realize that there are strong arguments that God was in the process of evolution and he created us through evolution. Now, when you're looking at let's say the Bible, for example, and Genesis, oftentimes people say that this is concordism, which is the idea that we're reading modern science into the Bible. But when you actually look at the translations of Genesis in their original format, you realize that this idea of a strict interpretation of Genesis doesn't even work. I mean, you have stuff like the sun being created, light being created after organisms were already created.
Right.
And so we can't really take Genesis literally. And when you actually examine stuff, you realize that this 7-day model, when we talk about God resting on the seventh day, they never say night or eve, day or night. So it's assumed by many people that God is continually resting. This might just be his pattern for creating the universe, 1 week over millions and millions of years.
So in other words, you're not taking it literally.
Literally,
you're just saying it's the idea of having a belief in God can coincide with science.
Yeah, and you should, as a religious person, you should not object to science. It's just our tool for understanding how the universe that God created works. So when I started looking at this, and then I started examining what it meant to be an atheist, there's a lot of holes in that. It's a very nihilistic lifestyle, and so I did a lot of research, and that's what we're going to be talking about today, is the arguments for God, and whether it's more reasonable to believe in God or not to believe in God.
Right.
So when I talk to an atheist a lot of times, one of the first things they mention, and this is a new argument that's not very philosophically sound, but they say that belief in God is like believing in a spaghetti monster in the sky, or Santa Claus, or the Tooth Fairy. Now, the reason why this is not the case at all is because we don't have any evidence to believe that Santa Claus, the Tooth Fairy, or spaghetti monster in the sky exists. Now, one thing from a court of law that you often hear is absence of proof is not proof of absence. So even if we didn't have proof of God's existence, it doesn't disprove his existence. Does that make sense?
Yeah, okay.
But I'm going to say that we do have proof of God's existence. So the reason why we don't believe in Santa Claus is because we don't receive presents every Christmas morning and have no idea where they come from.
Right.
We don't believe in the Tooth Fairy because we don't get money under our pillow every time that we lose a tooth. But as a child, we do. And until we know that it's our parents, we believe in the Tooth Fairy.
Yeah, until we know the source of what is causing this. We think, it must be because of something magical or beyond my comprehension.
Exactly. And so we don't have any reason to believe. Now, another thing I want to mention is that when we're talking about the existence of an immaterial being, we don't necessarily look for physical proof. Okay, so let's say that I'm wondering if, like, a girl like Sarah likes me, let's say.
Yeah.
I cannot logically deduce whether she likes me. What I do is make an inference, a best explanation to if she likes me. I look like, is she laughing at everything I say? Is she constantly hanging around me? Things like this. And then I make an inference that she must like me because of these things. The same thing is done when we consider an immaterial being. We make an inference. Like, we don't believe in Santa Claus because we can't make any inferences. We've been to the North Pole and we don't find a village of elves building presents. But when we talk about God, we can come up with inferences that explain that he must exist.
Right.
And that's where we get into arguments today. So the first argument, and this is an argument that I think is one of the most sound arguments for the existence of God, and probably the reason why I believe a God exists, is called the Kalam cosmological argument. Now, something that you need to understand before this, I talked before about inferences versus deductive reasoning. What you need to understand is something called a syllogism. A syllogism in logic is where you have premises and a conclusion that follows necessarily. And when I say a conclusion,
wait a minute.
I'm going to break this
in
up.
English, please. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So, a premise is like an argument. Like you say like this is true. This is true, therefore this is true.
Oh, like your beginning arguments, like an axiom. Like,
yeah, like
if A is true, then that means B must be true.
Right. So now what you're actually talking about is the antecedent. And there's different types of arguments. There's modus ponens, which is if A, then B, A, therefore B.
Okay.
Modus tollens, if A, then not B, A, therefore not B.
Yeah.
And then we have syllogisms, and that's what we're going to be dealing with today. And that's where we have a premises, another premises, and a conclusion that follows necessarily. And when I say necessarily, what I mean is that the conclusion has to follow the premises.
Okay, so rewind. So if you have these basic premises, that means the conclusion that we're coming at is automatic.
It's automatic.
It just happens.
So the only way to deny it is to deny a premises.
Okay.
Yeah, did you have an example of that?
Yeah, well, I guess like one example like in science is like if light can travel at the speed of light, then it can't decay with time. And so it's just an automatic thing.
Yeah.
So
it means it can't. Yeah. Exactly. It follows necessarily. So like a married bachelor cannot exist logically.
Right.
But if you're a bachelor, it necessarily follows that you're not married. It has to be in all possible worlds. Now that's the thing I'll get into later. All possible worlds.
Okay. Gotcha.
So what I'm going to give you is a syllogism for the existence of God. So the way that you deny this argument is you have to attack the premises to deny the conclusion.
Yep.
And that's what we're going to talk about. So the first argument, the cosmological argument for God's existence. So the first premises is whatever begins to exist has a cause.
Gotcha.
Second premises, the universe began to exist. And conclusion, therefore the universe has a cause.
Okay. So you're making a causal argument for the existence of the universe.
So I'm saying that because everything that begins to exist has a cause, the universe must have a cause. Therefore, the universe was caused by God.
Okay.
And I'll jump into why I'm going to say a transcendent being must have created the universe.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so whatever begins to exist has a cause. When we think about anything, if we find a ball in a field, it got there somehow.
Right.
But what we're really looking at is the first causal chain. How does nothing, before the Big Bang Theory, how does nothing become something?
Right.
It's illogical. It can't happen. So we have to say that God, by definition, transcends time, transcends creation. So we're saying because there's no logical explanation outside of an all-powerful being that transcends time and creation, the universe must have had a cause. And so we need to further strengthen this argument, we need to look at what are the causes of the universe. Like, what does science say is a cause, and do those go into the idea that God has created the universe?
Okay, yeah, let me just jump in as a counter-argument for this right now.
First.
So what I want to talk about is the oscillating model of the universe, or several models that say, well, the universe has actually just been here the entire time of eternity, so there's no cause for its existence in the first place. So let's kind of jump into matter and antimatter. And antimatter is kind of the stuff that opposes matter, and when it combines with matter, it automatically just explodes into energy. And a lot of people are like, well, why did we have a very little bit amount of antimatter in our universe and a lot of matter? Like, why weren't they just created equally? Mm-hmm. And to answer this, we have this, it's a donut theory from the book The God Problem. And what we're trying to figure out is, what's the answer to this? And the answer itself leads us to this model of an everlasting universe. Mm-hmm. And what it says basically is, you start with an equal amount.
Yeah.
But there's like an antimatter universe and then a matter universe. Mm-hmm. But they are kind of separated on the side. But they loop around back to each other with time, reunite, and explode again. And that sets off the next Big Bang. And you keep going and going and going.
Right. So what he's describing is the argument for the oscillating universe model.
And there are several other oscillating universe models as well.
Now, this is a pretty common argument and stuff. And this argument that the universe has existed eternally, was an argument that was really popularized by Bertrand Russell in the 60s. And back then is when the atheist movement was like making a lot of progress. You had very strong atheists who were intelligent, and they were pushing these ideas. The oscillating model was one, and the eternally existing model was another. So there's a lot of problems with this idea that the universe has existed eternally. So I'll get into the oscillating model, but let me first talk about just the concept of an eternal universe. So the first problem that you encounter deals with infinites. There's two types of infinites: potential infinites and actual infinites. An actual infinite is when you actually have an infinite number of things, and that's very impossible to conceptualize because you can't actually conceptualize.
Right.
Potential infinite is more like a limit. Like, like in math, you say, like, as this number approaches 10, we say as the number approaches infinity, and it just keeps getting bigger and bigger as a limit.
Gotcha.
So, like, what we have this problem of an actual infinite existing as a physical object. In mathematics, mathematicians believe that actual infinites exist in numbers sequences and stuff, that there's actually an infinite number of numbers, not a potential infinite. But when we talk about physical objects, there can't be an infinite number. And this is
so you're saying like an infinite number of repetitions of universes.
So a problem we have is the summation to an infinite thing. If we add a day to a day to a day to a day, we can never reach an infinite
day.
So a past cannot have an infinite series of days because we would never have now. It would just keep going on and on. So there's a conceptual problem with the idea of an actual infinite number of days in the past. But to me, the stronger arguments against this eternal universe are scientific arguments. So one argument is it's called the Guth-Van-Laken theorem. Guth and Van-Laken are both cosmologists, mathematicians who study the universe. And what their formula showed is that any expanding body had a beginning. And it's kind of an interesting fact that they presented their research to Stephen Hawking, a famous theoretical physicist, and he said that it was the strongest argument he's ever seen for the beginning of the universe.
Really?
And if many of you know, Hawking's, for most of his life, was a theist. I don't know where he stands right now on the topic, but basically their theory showed that any expanding body had to have a beginning, a point of singularity is what they call it. And so the Big Bang theory shows that is what we consider the beginning. You have a point of singularity and the point goes out. So any case where we have a beginning, there must be something greater behind it, an unmoved mover, as Plato would call it. Causing it. So the third scientific argument, is the idea of the third law of thermodynamics. And you might be able to explain this better, but it's the idea that the universe would experience a heat death.
Right, yeah. So actually it's the second law, but yeah, it's the second law. So the second law of thermodynamics describes entropy, and basically that is the measurement of disorder. So when you don't clean your room, things just kind of fall apart with time. It's just a natural thing that we accept. But there's an actual way to measure this with science, and it is kind of the destroyer of the universe. A lot of people are like, oh, we're going to just fall apart because of entropy. And what ends up happening is the more disorder that you have, the less energy you have to reorder everything back again. So, for example, like every time something decays or sometimes anything falls apart, it usually takes more energy to put it back together as it was, to order it properly, than it took to make it fall apart. So we're really losing energy, and from E equals mc squared, energy is matter, and so if you're losing energy, you're losing matter. So in reality, with time, with more entropy, you actually lose both energy and matter.
And what happens to the universe is something called heat death.
Right.
So the question is if the universe has existed eternally, then why has heat death not already happened? It would have happened long ago, and there would be no way that the universe would be able to sustain life.
It also heat death or a cold death. Like everything just goes into so much disorder that there's no way you can actually get everything organized to make a life form or anything.
Yeah, exactly. So the same problem affects this idea of an oscillating model that you talked about. What happens is entropy builds up with each oscillation.
Right.
And so if the universe had existed eternally and we've gone through tons of oscillations, there's no way at this time that we live in a life-permitting universe.
The probability of that would be very low.
Well, yeah, the probability would be incredibly low. But given the fact that the past is infinite, it would have already happened.
Right.
If that makes sense. So this idea that the universe could have existed eternally and the oscillating model of the universe don't really hold up.
Okay.
And so another argument that they make, the universe began to exist. Often people say, well, if the universe began to exist, then how did God begin to exist? And this is an important distinction that needs to be made in the argument, because it says whatever begins to exist has a cause. Not everything has a cause. The idea of God and the definitional understanding of God is that he is someone that transcends time and transcends creation. He does not have a cause, and that is what God is an uncaused, the unmoved mover.
So I have a question, just hypothetical. What if you just said that is the Big Bang? The Big Bang is something that has no cause.
The Big Bang.
What if I just said that? Like, that is part of the Big Bang.
Okay, so that comes into a very interesting question. So the reason why we assume that God has the qualities of of a person in essence, like the ability to make decisions, and he's not just a soccer ball in the sky that created the universe, let's say.
Yeah.
The reason why we distinguish that is because we assume that before the existence of time, that there was obviously no time, and there had to be a being that could make a decision to bring a universe into existence. It has to have a decision process.
You had an option to make the universe or not to make the universe.
Yes, and so it has to have a mind. It's being that exists eternally has to have a being that transcends time must have a mind, because if he transcends time and creation, there has to be a reason for bringing into creation the world.
Okay, so if it transcends something, it would probably make sense for him to be able to decide
the Big Bang
to make
would never happen. There's nothing to cause it to happen.
Right.
No decision making process, and that's why we assume that God has a decision making ability, because he brought the universe into existence when there was nothing.
Okay.
An unmaterial physical object has no way of bringing something into existence because it cannot perform any actions without thoughts. So that's the problem you have there. And so those are a couple of the scientific arguments now. And just to clarify, the Big Bang Theory is the generally accepted model of the universe at this time.
Right.
Now, there's other theories that people bring up, but the oscillating model is popular. The eternal universe is popular. And to me, this was the strongest argument. The eternal universe was the strongest argument until the Big Bang Theory became the accepted model. Because now people are pretty certain, and we can only know with some certainty because in science we make inferences, that everything began at a point of singularity, and therefore God had to exist before that point to push everything into existence.
Okay.
So that kind of brings us into the second argument of the existence of God. And this argument, Nick, you probably know more about than me, but it's called the teleological argument. Teleological argument is often called the fine-tuning argument. Now, this is actually a really fascinating thing that most people don't realize. So the argument goes as following. The fine-tuning of the initial conditions of the universe is due to law, chance, or design. It is not due to law or chance. Therefore, it is due to design. Now, this is another syllogism, so you have to attack one of the premises to deny the conclusion.
Right.
And so when we talk about, basically, why don't you describe, because you have a really good description of this, but how fine-tuned the universe is and what we mean by that.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. Basically, if you look at all the laws that we have right now, a lot of the equations that we have are built off of even more fundamental equations. And the whole idea of theoretical physics is to see what is the most fundamental equation that describes it all. Mm-hmm. And we're hitting some roadblocks right now. Like another podcast that we'll be talking about, we'll talk about why gravity doesn't work with quantum mechanics and why we're having issues with that. So the problem is we haven't found the most fundamental law. But what we have found are things that are constant numbers in our universe. Mm-hmm. They're just constant. And there's about 40 plus around there.
Yeah.
And the question is, why are they this number? Like, why is it, 2.3978? Why wasn't it 3.824? Mm-hmm. What is the reason for that? And we can't find a reason for that, except unless you take the many worlds theory.
Yeah, and I was actually about to describe that. So basically, these constants are so precise. I mean, we're talking like 10 to the 300th.
Yeah, they're so extremely precise that they allow the laws that we observe in our universe
exist
today.
And they allow a life-permitting universe. And
Exactly.
Remember, there's a distinction between living in a life-permitting universe and having life on Earth. Like, the probability of life on Earth forming is very low, but the probability of being in a life-permitting universe is even lower.
It's
because
much
of these
lower.
constants. Now, this is kind of an example I've heard of that describes the improbability of a life-permitting universe existing. But imagine you shoot a gun and you shoot a bullet across the universe. The precision of these numbers is like hitting a nickel all the way across the universe.
Yeah.
So from one side to the other, hitting that nickel. That's how improbable it is that our life-permitting universe exists.
I mean, just to give you an example, like if the electron was a little bit more massive, then it wouldn't be able to stay in orbit in the proper orbiting shells around like a nucleus, and then we wouldn't be able to have atoms, and then we wouldn't have tissue, and so on.
Yeah, exactly. And so what you see is that these constants are so tight. So the way that an atheist gets around this is the many worlds hypothesis, which is also called the multiverse.
Right.
Now, what they argue is that there's so many universes out there that it's inevitable that one of them would be life-permitting, and we happen to live in one of the life-permitting universes.
And that's called the anthropic principle.
And that's called the anthropic. Well, the anthropic principle is actually the idea that if we live in a life-permitting universe, then it's likely that life-permitting is more likely than we think.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So, and so there's this theory that there's millions, billions, and billions of universes, and so like one of them must have life, and that we live in one that does. So the thing about the multiverse is that the multiverse hypothesis actually has a lot of problems to it, and it's actually not a good argument because, firstly, it's very theoretical and unfalsifiable.
Right.
We can never we probably won't reach the end of our universe anytime in the near future, and so it's hard for us to see outside of our universe. Mm-hmm. So we can't necessarily prove that there are other universes. Secondly, the multiverse runs into the same problem that the Kalam cosmological argument illustrates.
Exactly. Yeah.
Is that where did the multiverse come from? And
Right.
the multiverse has the same problems with infinites, with the laws of entropy. the summation of infinites, things like that of that nature. So you say, how can these universes exist? And even if they do exist, it doesn't disprove the existence of God in any way whatsoever.
Right. That's
all
true.
it does is explain how it's possible to have fine tuning.
Yes, exactly.
And bringing back to the oscillating model, the other problem you have is how did this incredibly fine-tuned oscillating model come into existence to begin with?
Well, you could have multiple oscillating universes.
Yeah, and so that's we throw in the multiverse into that also.
Right.
And so that's why when we think about this incredibly fine tuning, we have to ask ourselves: is it more likely from chance, or is it more likely cause
from design?
And so there's a logical problem with this multiverse idea and the conclusions that we draw from it, because we can actually use this multiverse idea to make anything possible. So let's say you live on a planet where in the clouds every day it spells God is real.
Yeah.
Now, does that mean God is real, or does it mean that there's so many universes out there that it's inevitable that one of those universes has clouds that say God is real on a planet?
Right. Yeah.
And so we can use it to prove anything that we want to.
Right.
So I actually think this is a great analogy to kind of describe the flaw of this. So imagine that you're playing poker with your friends, and your friend gets like 17 royal straight flushes in a row. Now, do you conclude that he got 17 royal straight flushes in a row because there's so many universes out there, and in one of those universes, someone's going to get 17 in a row? Or do you first assume that it was done by design, that he cheated?
He cheated, yeah.
That it was done by design and he cheated. And so what we see is that our first initial assumption is that he cheated. So why do we not do the same thing with the universe? Why do we say, all this improbability is explained by this or that? And so actually, Nick brought up another good point with the entropic principle. Now, what it says is, like, if we live in a life-permitting universe, then the probability of a life-permitting universe must be higher than we think because we're alive.
Right.
Now, I think that this actually carries with it some logical flaws, too. So this analogy kind of shows that. But if you win the lottery, let's say, you can win the lottery and still recognize the improbability of winning it. Mm-hmm. You can still recognize that, like, I'm that 1 in 175 million person. Right. And another analogy is, like, imagine you're in front of a firing squad of highly trained archmen.
Yeah.
And they are, like, 5 feet away from you, about to execute you. They say 1, 2, 3, and they fire, and none of them hit you. You're not dead. You're still alive. Now, you're still alive. Do you still possess that ability to realize how improbable it was that you would still be alive?
Right.
So just because you're alive does not necessarily mean that you cannot recognize the improbability of being alive. And so that's a challenge that's often brought up as the entropic principle, and that's why I think it is not a logically sound challenge. So we've kind of discussed the cosmological argument and the teleological argument. Now I kind of want to, like, switch directions and talk about an argument that's very different, but which to me is very important, and that's the moral argument. So this is the argument as a syllogism. So if God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist.
Okay.
Objective moral values do exist, therefore God exists. So
Okay.
when I say objective moral values, what I mean are values that are true all of the time, regardless of what society thinks. They're always true. So a common example that's brought up is if Nazi Germany had won World War II and brainwashed all of society to believe that exterminating the Jews was okay, is it still wrong that they exterminated the Jews? Is there something outside of human thought that says that that's wrong?
Okay, I see what you're saying, yeah.
And most people, they're born intuitively to believe in objective morals. And so an atheist actually has to say that there's no such thing as objective morals. If Nazi Germany had won the war and brainwashed everyone, then there was nothing wrong with those actions.
Yeah, well, let me just kind of give a counter-argument to this.
Okay.
To me, it's kind of funny because a lot of times the objective morals that we think are objective and they're right happen to be the ones that allow us to survive the most.
Right.
And that coincides with evolution. So the question becomes, well, are these objective morals outside of us, or we are led to believe them, but in reality, if we didn't believe them, then we would have died. So that's why we do believe them.
Right, so what you're bringing up is an argument on that morals are formed from evolutionary needs.
Yeah,
need for
and
survival.
the fact that you think that they're objective is also from evolution, too.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So what you're actually distinguishing is the difference between moral ontology and moral epistemology. So moral ontology deals with whether more objective morals exist or not, and moral epistemology is like, if they do, how do we know what they are, and why do we follow certain rules and not others? Obviously, there are rules that are created by society so that we can live more peacefully. The laws that fit into the objective rules are not easily distinguishable between those ones. A objective law would be to say, like, it is always wrong, no matter what, to take an infant and torture them.
Yes, but right.
But it's not to say that, like, lying to your friend is necessarily an objectively moral thing. Things of that nature may very well come from the evolutionary process. Objective means that there are certain things that are always bad, but it doesn't say that every single law that we follow, every single law in the Bible, is necessarily an objective one. How we distinguish what's right and what's wrong is why we have moral progression, like why as a person you can become a better person. But yes, what you bring up is this idea of evolutionary. But you also have to recognize that if we do have evolutionary reasons for our morals, then they are subjective. And that means that they are meaningless. They don't really matter in the scheme of things. We are a tiny speck in the universe. And we're going to all be dead in a short period of time. So whether or not I treat someone well or not doesn't really matter. And that's you still abide by them because they're society's guidelines, but there's no core to that. So the thing that what you see is that a lot of people will deny the first premise is if God does not exist, objective morals do not exist. They will deny that, but then they will also deny the second one that says objective moral values do exist.
Okay.
No, they'll accept that, but you can't accept that objective morals exist and subjective morals. Sorry, you can't accept that objective moral values do exist, but that God doesn't exist, because without God, there's no way to ground the morals.
Right. So, okay. In other words, you need You need
God
for objective morals.
Yeah, so a lot of people, like Richard Dawkins, for example, is a very prominent atheist. And he wants to tell people that we need to limit segregation, that we need to not be racist, and that we need to not do this and that. And he's very adamant about these positions he has. But what he doesn't seem to realize is that what he's saying is meaningless, because if morals are just subjective, then what people think in their head is what matters. It's not objectively true.
Right, and so for that matter, why should I listen to you if my opinion is just as valuable as yours?
Yeah, and so why? Yeah, exactly. And so why listen to Richard Dawkins when we can just
make our own?
And why does he care about it when his position is that things are subjective? Now, I have a lot of respect for atheists who actually take on the position of subjective morals, but most people are unwilling to do that. Most people are unwilling to say that Nazi Germany would be okay, given that people were brainwashed. Torturing a little kid would be okay, given that society was allowed to do it. Most people object against that. But then they also want to object that God doesn't exist.
I think the thing, though, is that it's just...
It does exist, sorry.
Right, but I think for me, what I'm saying about this evolution theory is that you really can't... You don't want to torture anybody, because that only hurts your society as a whole.
Right, yeah.
So you wouldn't...
But the question then is, why are there certain acts that people deem moral that go against the grain of survival? Like Martin Luther King's whole movement of anti-segregation... he pretty much died for that movement, and he took on this risk of being killed and being harassed by all of these different people in order to do that. So why would he take on some duty when the cause is death and causes?
Oh, I see what you're saying.
And so you have heroes and stuff. You have a hero who people naturally, intuitively find honorable and stuff, things like that. But their actions are heroic and they die doing it. So why would someone die when survival is the key? How can an action be moral but then cause a person to die?
I think that becomes a little bit complex.
Yeah,
I think his willingness, his goal to fight segregation, that is itself is a good trait, because a segregated society is not as good as a society that's united.
Yeah.
So that in itself.
But why is it that Martin Luther, for example, why is it that a segregated society is not better? Why is it? No, is better. It's not better.
It's not better.
Why is it that certain things like murdering people and things like that? Oh, obviously those make sense.
But
murder is bad. Segregation. Why is that? Why is it any better without objective morals to have a segregated society and a non-segregated society?
Well, I think we talked about this in the last podcast, but
yeah.
I would say if you have more numbers, you're able to individualize more and specialize more. And so if you have more people who are specialized, it's more efficient.
But I think you might be giving evolution too much credit, because evolution doesn't have a mind like this. People have individual minds and stuff. And obviously slavery is not a very economically sound means of getting results, but why does it feel like moral progress to move away from segregation, as opposed when for hundreds of years people were in slavery?
Right, and I agree with you. I think that's completely wrong on multiple reasons, multiple levels. But I'm just saying strictly from a survival aspect. It is better to have everyone equal and for everyone to be specialized in a specific
But
task.
You're saying that people must, Martin Luther must have this inherent quality to him that causes him to recognize what is better for the survival of people. And where does that come from? How does evolution produce such a inherent idea and then cause a person to do it? Is evolution some mechanism that gets into the mind of people and then takes their actions over and causes them to do certain things? Or
well, I think in this specific question, I would talk about what are called mirror neurons. And mirror neurons are neurons that you feel they're the kind of reason why people watch sports. When you watch somebody swing a bat or swing a golf club, you actually feel like you are doing that. Or when someone slams a home run, you feel like you just slammed the home run. Mm-hmm. They're responsible for empathy too. But the point is that imagine you were on top of things, you were kind of a higher up guy, and you saw a person below you being mistreated. the fact that you're seeing this person activates your mirror neurons, and you think you are that person, and you think to yourself, I would never want to be treated like that myself. So therefore, I think that is wrong. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So, but what you have to then argue that it's better for people to help someone of lower stature than to care about their own survival, which you could argue and stuff.
Right.
I think that's the question: is that the case? Like, like we lived in a society that was much more like man eat man society, like one person competing against another. So when you have these people who, we obviously have empathy, and you're right, mirror neurons cause that, but you have to ask yourself, is it better for our survival for us to help the lower man than it is for us to look out for our own needs? And you have to then say that there's something beyond the person, the individual person, because why would they risk their own life? We're talking about their survival. So the last argument, actually might be the second to last argument I want to talk about, is an argument that I think is the reason why most people believe in God. I don't think it's necessary for everybody to have logical reasons for believing in God.
Yeah.
I think only one logical reason is necessary. And this is the type of argument I call a basic belief. It says that beliefs which are appropriately grounded may be rationally accepted as basic beliefs, not grounded on argument. So that means I don't need to have an argument to hold a belief. So an example of this is like a lot of people believe in God because they experience God. They sing music, they experience God, they have veridical experiences of God. And to say that this is not a logical reason to believe in God is to say that they can't trust their own gut, their own intuition. And if they can't trust their own gut and intuition, then why can you trust your own gut and intuition when you say that they're wrong? And so a basic belief is a very sound logical argument. So let's say, like in philosophy, you have the idea of skeptics. Like, how can we know that we're not just living in the matrix and we aren't real people? We can't know that. But what we can assume is that we're not living in the matrix unless a defeater is present. And a defeater is when an argument that suggests the contrary.
It has evidence for it?
It has evidence for it. So we continue believing that our external reality is real and not the matrix unless a good argument is put up that we are in the matrix.
Gotcha.
And the same thing holds to belief in God. I believe in God until someone gives me a reason to not believe in God. And when people have these experiences of God, we should trust them unless a defeater is present. And in most cases, a good defeater isn't present.
Right.
And so I do want to talk about some of the atheist arguments that I think are strong arguments and hard questions for people who do believe in God.
Okay.
So to me, in my opinion, the strongest argument that atheists present is the argument of evil. And what this argument says is, how is it that if a maximally benevolent God exists, that we have so much bad stuff, so much despair in this world, kids starving, children dying at young ages, parents getting cancers, natural disasters, how is it that God would allow this to exist? Now, what's really interesting about this is that this argument is no longer argued in the philosophical community because Alvin Plantinga, a theist philosopher, came up with a response to it that actually puts the burden of proof on the atheists now.
Really?
And so now atheist philosophers no longer argue this because it's considered an answered argument. So let me get to how you answer this. Now, this is going to get into some technical philosophy terms, so I'll do my best to describe what I am saying. So you need to understand this idea of possible worlds. A possible world is any world that could logically exist. So
kind of like the many worlds we were talking about earlier?
Try to separate it from that. It's a very different idea. So let's say there's a world that possibly could have existed where we didn't do a podcast today.
Okay.
It's very possible.
That would have been a very depressing world, yeah.
Let's say there's a possible world where yesterday you got into a car crash. It's logically possible.
Yeah.
But what's not logically possible is a world where like married bachelors exist.
Yeah.
Because it's logically incoherent for someone to both be married and be a bachelor at the same time.
Gotcha.
So a possible world is one where a bachelor is single. Cats might not have whiskers. That's a logical world because our evolutionary process could have caused cats to not have whiskers by random mutation.
Yeah.
And so the idea is that like a possible world is one where everything is logical and stuff. And so this is the argument that Alvin Plantinga made. Is okay. So to understand Alvin Plantinga's argument, you have to understand the concept of free will also.
Okay.
So we need to realize that for someone to have free will, it follows that their designer wanted them to have free choice. He gave them that ability. A god that determines everything about people is just making puppets. He's just a puppet master.
Right.
The person's just doing everything that he wants them to do. So the idea behind Plantinga's argument is that God wanted to give people free will, and that this is part of his maximally benevolent quality is he wanted people to have the choice between doing what's right and doing what's wrong and being influenced by both good and evil. So he had to give them free will. And so before he created the world, he had to think about the possible worlds that could follow from giving free will. Now, having free will implies that there's also going to be evil in the world. That people are going to make a bad decision that affects another person in a bad way.
Well, why would they do that? I mean, it could be possible that everyone doesn't make a bad decision, right?
Yeah, it is possible, but
Highly
it's
unlikely.
just not likely given human nature, given our survival qualities and things of that sort.
Right.
And so, the argument is that given a world of free will, there will be evil because people will have the choice between good and bad, and people will sometimes do what's wrong.
Right.
Okay. So what the idea is that God examined these possible worlds that could follow. Remember we talked about possible worlds, and it's like a logically possible world that could follow from these series of events. And the idea is that God examined all possible worlds given free will, and he chose the best world that had free will. So that's why we have evil in the world. That's why we have these bad things happen. But we assume that there were worlds that were much worse that God examined.
Oh, okay.
We're assuming that God is maximally benevolent and also can see, like, beyond time,
right.
To see the end results, to see what follows. And so, like, a Christian might say that God created the world that brought the most people to heaven.
Yeah, so it's like flipping argument. You're saying, well, don't look at all the evil. Look at how much good there is.
Yeah.
It could be much worse.
It could, yeah.
Instead of saying there's a lot of evil,
I don't want to say
it could
be much worse necessarily, but we're just saying that out of all the possible worlds, you have to prove that that there could have been a better world with free will.
Oh, I
to
see.
say that the problem of evil is a strong argument against God's existence.
Yeah, I get you.
And because God has to obey logic himself, this idea that God does not have the power to make a married bachelor. He is construed to the same laws of logic that we follow. And so we're saying that the best logically possible world you could create was one that we live in. And
Gotcha.
It's the atheist's job to then have the burden of proof of proving that a better world could have been made by God.
Well, I think another thing that the atheist could point out, though, is the question of free will. And that's a really big topic.
Yeah.
So one theory is that you don't have free will, but you have the perception of having free will.
Right.
So, like, suppose you are a puppet, but you as a puppet believe that you aren't a puppet.
Yeah. And then you have to also ask, like, if you have the perception of free will, if the person who came up with this idea that people just have the perception of free will, how did he come up with this idea with just the perception of free will?
Right.
So
that's probably
you
another.
have to say that his it's sort of, I mean, it gets into really complicated stuff. And actually, whether or not we have free will is such a long debate that I don't even want to get into it today because I want to focus mainly on whether or not it's reasonable to believe in God.
Right.
So just to add up some stuff that I've thrown together so far, we have the cosmological argument for God's existence. As we showed, it's not logically possible to have a infinite universe that's existed infinitely. In philosophy, they call that physical necessity. We talked about logical necessity, where it deductively follows, and logically necessarily has to be true. Physical necessity is a universe existing eternally. We saw why that doesn't work because of science. So a lot of scientific studies suggest that. Not studies, but research shows that there's flaws in that. We saw that the universe is incredibly fine-tuned. Now, I do want to bring up one quick point about the fine-tuning, because I was reading an article yesterday about a new scientific study that the article claimed it was greater proof that the multiverse was true. The multiverse, many worlds hypothesis was true. So what the research showed is that the universe is actually more fine-tuned than last thought. So you have to ask yourself, is this actually evidence for a multiverse or evidence for a creator? Because you're assuming that because it's less fine-tuned that a multiverse must be responsible for it.
Yeah.
I don't want to get too much into that. So we showed that the fine-tuning of the universe, it's so precise that the probability of living in a universe that's life-permitting is so small that we should account it to a creator, not to random chance. Because if we go with the random chance idea, then anything is possible. We can argue for anything. It's not a valid form of argument. And then we also discussed the moral reasons to believe in God. And this kind of gets into this idea of, like, nihilism. So if, like, there is no God, then there is no meaning to life. There is no moral good. There's no evil good, anything. It just is what it is, and we're just going to die as a species in a short period of time in the infinitesimal universe.
And there's no objective morals.
There's no objective morals. So that, to me, was something that was really hard to accept when I was looking at the atheist worldview. Some atheists will argue that atheism isn't a worldview, but I would like to argue the contrary because, did I discuss this earlier? But they say, like, for example, if you believe in the tooth fairy, then not believing in the tooth fairy is not a worldview, sort of thing.
Okay.
So the absence of belief in something is not a worldview. But the absence of belief in God implies that you believe that the universe must have existed eternally.
Yes.
Or there's some cause that is unknown to people. And it implies that there's no objective morals, and most likely implies that you believe in materialism and naturalism. Okay. So being an atheist is a worldview.
Gotcha.
But that's a lot of terminology. I hate to throw that around. And then lastly, we saw that it's perfectly reasonable to believe in God because you experience God. You don't need logical reasons. Just like we experience the eternal world on a daily basis and believe it's real, we can experience God and believe it's real for that reason. So those are 5 arguments. We also saw that the argument for evil is no longer a very strong argument that's used by atheists. And obviously we could get into a lot more stuff. I mean, there's probably people who would spend 15 of these podcasts on just one of these topics.
Right.
But what I wanted to show today is that belief in God is reasonable. These are strong arguments. They're debated at the highest levels of philosophy, highest levels of science. And this is why so many scientists are becoming theists and why it's still debated. This idea that religion and the existence of God is done and we have to progress as a society is just ridiculous, because our evidence to believe in God, I think, is more reasonable than to not believe in God.
All right, and with that, we'll be seeing you guys on the next episode.